Hello again. In this talk we're going to explore from our HTML preview material, we're going to look at templates. Templates are an essential feature of modern web development. Templating system I'm going to discuss here is called EJS. It's not the templating language we'll be using in our course in Regensburg, but it is fairly close to it in temperament and structure. So exploring it in a little bit will set us up nicely for when we start the course proper. Let's talk about templates then. This is the course, the demonstration web page we were looking at in the previous talk. It's a series of 7 or 8 pages. It's a simple brochure site. We constructed that website without using any templating technology at all. Each page was a standalone, completely separate page. In particular, each of the 7 pages had a head and body. Each body had a header and footer. And these header and footers were all identical. In fact, we had 21 repeated sections throughout that site. That's called practice. To avoid that, it's called don't repeat yourself. That type of repetition can be quite detrimental to longer term maintenance of web pages, as obviously a mistake or an evolution in the header or in some aspect of the style would have meant considerable replication of the code necessary to fix such elements. So don't repeat yourself. Dry versus wet, write everything twice, or we enjoy typing somewhat humorously, is a principle we'd like to adopt into our page design, and templates are ideal for doing this. So the idea would be we would have a single header and a single footer, and we would just include those in all the pages as needed. It's a concept you're familiar with in programming in general, I think. Templating systems allow us to do just this. They allow us to assemble pages from fragments or from pieces. And they're simple to learn, really, relatively inexpensive to implement, and we'll be able to employ simple templating techniques in our lab very quickly. We need a template engine to do this. The templating engine will be able to assemble complete pages from individual fragments. So a request will arrive into the browser, from the browser to the templating engine. Templating engine then will have to secure from a template repository of some kind templates which are incorporated into by the templating engine to individually created web pages. It's a process of assembling, really, from fragments complete pages. Browsers themselves only understand whole pages, not individual fragments. In the labs that accompany this talk, I have selected the HARP templating engine. It's a very simple server you can launch on your own computers, and it supports a variety of templating languages. It is a templating engine we can use. So in the lab that goes with this talk, you'll be taking the complete page we built previously and turning it into a fully templated site using EJS templating system. This means extracting out from our website reusable fragments. We'll call them includes in this instance: curriculum, footer, header, sponsor, summary. And then each of our strand pages is made up of a reusable layout, and then we rework the pages to use those layouts and those fragments. Finally, our home page is dramatically simplified. Overall, you notice we've got more files, so it has gone up in terms of the file count, but less content. If we were to count the number of lines in our website after we've gone through this exercise, we'd find its reduction is significant. To use the system, we have to install the HARP server. There are instructions on that on the lab, and once we've installed the HARP server, we launch it. And once we've launched it, we have a website running on our local host. So it'll be running here on 9000 by default. And if we browse to that site, well, we'll have the complete page. Now the pages may be non-templated, so initially you will just take over the site as we had previously, but in the lab we gradually reduce the repetition and we introduce the partials, as we call it, or includes, and layouts, as we've just overviewed. So among the steps you carry out in the lab would be to create EJS files. So these are our templates, and the EJS files contain just those reusable fragments that we think can be shared, header and footer, and then we can include those fragments via the partial syntax. And this is the simple clause we put into our page here, and that will include that template into the page we're building at this point. You'll notice special notation we're using here is left angle bracket %- and % right angle bracket. These are effectively escape sequences, which indicate that content within those delimiters is intended for the templating engine. If, however, you decide to load a web page directly from disk and not using a templating engine, these cannot be interpreted by a web browser and are just rendered as such. There is a little bit of work in the lab around assets. We're putting all our images into an assets folder. If you did the previous lab, you might have seen a lot of relative paths associated with the asset folders access. Relative paths, as in this example here, or others where you would have been using ... Once we switch to using a templating engine on a web server, we can use absolute paths. That makes our web authoring experience considerably simpler. So we move away from relative to absolute, and we use absolute references to all our images subsequently. We also rename the files in the exercise. Instead of HTML, we're using EJS. EJS is more convenient for our templating engine because it'll automatically apply the engine to them when we load the pages. Here now we're seeing an evolution of the page including headers and footers. So we've got a partial to include the header, partial to include the footer, and then the main content of one of those specific pages. So our page structure is already very logical, and because it's defined to match the content, we can easily see candidates here for individual templates. And this is the structure as it's mapped out in our evolving website. And we see we are now reducing our home page to just contain all partial includes. So we're including a header, summary, curriculum, sponsors, and footer. And that corresponds to the structure we had laid out in our page originally. These are the summary and sponsors pages. Again, these are standalone templates now. They're not complete web pages. And you will notice they do not contain header or body elements. So there is nothing in the element to indicate that there is nothing before here, and there's nothing down here either. The pages themselves are just fragments of pages that have no value on their own. This is our curriculum page, and this is how the page is rendered by HARP when we run the page under the web server. These partials then allow us to really break a page up into sensible, reusable parts, and it takes us a considerable way to removing the duplication of the page itself. Now, one other concept in templating is layouts. And layouts means we can go a little bit further in terms of our reusability, and we can reuse not just fragments of pages, but the entire page superstructure. And we can substitute in then parts of the page in each individual sub page. So layouts are always called _layout.ejs. They can contain standard HTML. They may include partials themselves. But layouts, to make any sense, must always have a yield clause. And this means that any page using the layout will have its content injected into the yield element. So our layout usage in our little case study is inside the strands set of pages. We have one layout, and that one layout applies to data, devices, maths, networks, programming, and project. So all 6 of those pages use that one layout. Here's the layout itself. It contains standard HTML head and body. The head includes the appropriate style sheets and fonts. All of the bodies contain header and footer from our partials. And then we've got a yield, which means each individual page will have different content. So we've got a programming being injected in there. Okay, EJS is a richer language than I have proposed here. It's still widely used. We could have used it in our own forthcoming web services and applications course, but we're using another subsystem called Handlebars, which is fairly closely aligned with it, so we'll be able to switch over easy enough. If you want to learn more, you can learn more on the EJS site itself. The HARP system also supports Jade, which is another templating language. This is a little bit different from the EJS or Handlebars approaches in that you can see on the left here, Jade takes us to a different dialect for expressing HTML completely. So you'll notice on the left here, if I want a head element, I am now dealing with just header on angle brackets, whereas obviously over on the right here, we've got the complete HTML definition. And notice on the left here, the head element has no closing element and there's no angle brackets, so there's a reduction in overall size. Taking another example, if we look in Jade at its use of or representation of a H1, that's a H1 in standard HTML. If we're using the Jade notation, it's expressed simply as the tag H1 without an angle brackets and the actual H1 itself on the same line. We won't be using Jade, but it's a reasonably influential templating engine and represents a category of engine that simplifies HTML itself as opposed to just augmenting HTML with additional meta tags. Okay, that's how we generated in the lab our templated version of our case study. If you look into the lab, one of the steps involves issuing a command, the HARP compile command. And this compile command will generate a static version of a templated site. That is, when you run the command, you will be generating more or less the same site we had produced in the previous case study, which was the non-templated site produced from the templated site we looked at earlier. This means that we could deploy our templated site on a static file, maybe on disk that's browsed directly, or maybe on a content provider network that doesn't support the templating engine we've chosen. Okay, that's that. I'll return shortly to talk a little bit about deployment.